Alright, so today I want to discuss the visual influence of Hets in ball pythons. And usually when we talk about Hets, we mean one copy of a recessive gene in ball pythons. And pretty much the definition of a recessive gene is that normally you need two copies of the recessive for a visual influence on the ball python. And sometimes you can see one copy of a recessive gene in certain circumstances and with certain genes and combinations. And you may be familiar with het pied markers, the tracks along the belly on pieds. That is just one example. There's quite a few other examples where you can actually see Hets shining through in some combinations. So today I want to jump over the internet and I want to show you some of the visual influences that one copy of a recessive gene can have on the visual appearance of a ball python. Alright, so I'm going to jump over here on Morphmarket.com and I want to show you this snake right here. This is a pied ball python. This is a recessive mutation. You need two copies of the pied for visual, and essentially what the pied does is it brings in these big patches of white, and sometimes you can have a really high white pied and sometimes you can have a low white. It's kind of unpredictable as far as the amount of white. Sometimes you can actually mix certain genes in with the pied to force the high white or the low white. And kind of the interesting thing with the pied is I'd say it's probably one of the most common genes that you'll see as a single gene het in a lot of other combinations. Sometimes you can actually pick out the het pieds even though you don't know 100% sure that pied is in the mix. Sometimes you can see the markers, and based on the markers you're like, yep, that is 100%, even though the statistics may not say you're 100%. So for example, you can actually take a het pied, breed it to something else, and 50% of the offspring come out as pied. And with most recessives, you can't tell which one carries the pied and which one doesn't. But with the pied, sometimes you can actually see with certain genes and combinations, you can definitely see that pied is in the mix. So take a look at this. If you actually took a pied and you bred it to like a normal, classic wild type ball python, this is what you would get. You would get het pieds. And this is what a het pied looks like. It essentially looks like a normal ball python. As a matter of fact, this is actually het pied, possible het black axanthic, possible het albino. And in some genes like the het albino, I don't think there are any markers, just standalone or with other combinations. I don't think you can ever really see the het albino. As a matter of fact, most hets you really can't see just one copy of the gene. And if you actually take a look at this just from the top, you really can't see that this is het pied until you flip over the snake and take a look at the belly of the snake. And take a look at this. This is kind of I'd say this is kind of the classic het pied markers that you'll see on a lot of ball pythons. And essentially what you get is you get kind of a line coming right down kind of either side of the belly. As a matter of fact, this one's a little bit higher than the belly, kind of an unusual het pied. I actually pulled up another one over here. Usually what you see on a het pied is right down the belly on either side of the belly, usually right before the vent where they kind of go to the bathroom down here. It looks like someone like took a Sharpie marker and drew little lines on either side of the belly of the snake, and those are the het pied markers. And usually with the het pied markers that are on the belly, I'd say in most cases you can only see them on just your normals. A lot of times with other combinations you can't see het pieds. I've actually had like coral glow het pieds, you can't see them on the belly. I've had lemon blast het pieds and you cannot see them on there. So in fact, I pulled this one up. Take a look at this. This is a pastel het pied, and in this case you can actually see maybe just a little bit right on the belly, right down here. Sometimes maybe just a little bit up here. And I'd say het pied markers on the belly are not 100% as far as being on every single het pied. So I'd say maybe, pretty much in my experience, I'd say maybe about 1 out of 3 snakes have the het pied markers along the belly. And most people will say, yeah, if it has like really strong het pied markers, especially like this one over here, you can actually see the line really strong in here. Most people will see that even if the statistics don't say it's 100%, like if it's 50% and you see those really strong lines, most people will say, yeah, that is definitely 100% het pied based on the markers on the belly. So take a look at this. This is actually the champagne, and if you actually work one copy of the pied gene in with the champagne, you can definitely tell in most cases that the het pied is in the mix, just one copy of the pied. So the champagne is kind of an interesting gene. Usually it's really visually dominant, and a lot of times you work other genes into the champagne, and you'll end up most of the time with like a patternless snake that is a slightly different color than working other genes in the mix. Sometimes it can be kind of a challenge to work other genes in the champagne. And probably one of the best things that I think you can do with the champagne is if you take a champagne and you breed it to a visual pied with 2 copies of the pied, half the offspring would come out as champagne, and all those champagnes would be het pied with 1 copy of the pied. And take a look what a champagne het pied looks like. This is pretty amazing. It almost looks like a visual pied. I say in almost every case that I've seen with the champagne and 1 copy of the pied, it really looks like a visual pied. As a matter of fact, if you took a champagne and made the visual pied with 2 copies of the pied, what you actually end up with is a completely white snake with no pattern at all, which is pretty amazing. So here you can definitely see 1 copy of the pied gene in this combination. So take a look at this. This can kind of trick you too. This is actually, this is a pastel gray matter, and the gray matter is the champagne with the combination of super cinnamon. So as a matter of fact, this almost looks like a champagne het pied, although there's no pied in the mix. Sometimes they can trick you. Sometimes you can see these big splotches of white on the snake. Sometimes it can look like a pied, and as a matter of fact, sometimes it can kind of trick you because a lot of times you kind of look at the genetics and you're almost expecting het pied in the mix with champagne, and depending on the other genes in the mix, you can actually get kind of a pseudo het pied visual appearance, which is kind of interesting. So here is another example where you can actually see the het pied influence in another combination. This is actually the pewter, and the pewter is the combination of pastel and cinnamon, and it's kind of an interesting effect. The cinnamons can be really variable. Sometimes you can get really metallic looking pewters, and sometimes they can be pretty browned out, like almost like a coppery color, kind of depending on the version of cinnamon. There's quite a few versions of cinnamon, and there's quite a few versions of pastel too, and kind of mixing those together, you can get really different effects in the pewter. But if you mix het pied in with the pewter, usually you can see a really dramatic effect of it kind of washing out the sides and kind of fading it out. And most people, they have a pewter that's faded out and they're like, oh, that is definitely 100% het pied based on the visual appearance. So this is what the pewter looks like, and take a look at this. This is what the pewter looks like with 1 copy of the pied gene. Pretty amazing effect from one to the other. As a matter of fact, I've seen a lot of them over here. It'll say like a pewter, 66% het pied, and they'll say down in the description, this is definitely het pied based on how the pattern is kind of washed out like this with the het pied. So here's another combination where most of the times you can actually see 1 copy of a pied gene in there. This is the super cinnamon, and the cinnamon by itself can be really variable. As a matter of fact, cinnamon was part of the pewter, and cinnamon by itself can almost look like a normal, and sometimes they can look kind of like a coppery colored snake. And if you actually breed 2 cinnamons together, 25% of the time you get a super cinnamon. And the super cinnamons can really vary. Sometimes they can be an almost jet black snake, and sometimes they can be kind of a reddish brown. In most cases, they're a completely patternless snake, and the super cinnamon sometimes will have little kind of anomalies, like little paradoxes here and there through the snake, which is pretty common. And usually they're pretty solid black or brown the whole way. And here's what happens if you take 1 copy of the pied gene and mix it in with the super cinnamon. Take a look at this. This almost looks like a visual pied, and I'd say in most cases with the super cinnamon het pieds, you don't really get, your traditional pied looking with multiple patches of white through the snake. Usually it's just a little ringer right on the back of the snake. Sometimes I'd say this is probably the biggest ringer that I've seen on a super cinnamon. And here's another example of a super cinnamon het pied, and I'd say this is probably a more typical example of what the het pied influence can do with the super cinnamon. A lot of times it'll bring up kind of this white just on the belly. It almost looks like, I don't know if you've seen like the reticulated python pieds, the retics, the visual pieds with 2 copies of the recessive pied. Sometimes they don't really look like the ball pythons. They have kind of this pied right on the bottom. That's kind of what it looks like on the super cinnamon het pied with just 1 copy of the pied. Alright, so I'm going to switch from pines over to the ghost. This is what a ghost looks like. This is actually a hypo. Hypo is another name for ghost. And believe it or not, the hypo with just one copy of the ghost gene worked into some combinations, pretty much worked into anything. Usually you can see a brightening effect with one copy of the ghost. And essentially what the ghost is, it's a recessive mutation where you need two copies of the gene to actually get a visual. And if you actually do hit the visual, you get kind of like this creamy, washed out appearance. Sometimes it can almost look like the snake's getting ready to go into shed or something. And let me tell you, the more I look into ghosts, the more it really grows on me. And some ghosts are really orange, like this one. As a matter of fact, there's actually a line of ghosts called the orange ghost, which is pretty much almost exactly like this. This looks like an orange ghost. And the regular line of ghost usually is kind of like a normal looking snake that's a little bit faded out. And there's definitely some overlap between just the regular ghost and the orange ghost. Sometimes you can find some really bright orange regular ghosts like this one that look almost like an orange ghost. And it's kind of weird when you work it into combinations, it brightens it. As a matter of fact, I actually have a couple lessers here in my collection. I pulled up a couple lessers and I kind of wanted to show you the influence of one copy of the ghost, what that will do to the lesser. I actually have some adult female breeders, two of them. One of them is possible het ghost, although I have never proven it out and tried to breed a ghost to it. And the other one is just a regular lesser, but you can definitely tell if you line them up side by side, the possible het ghost is quite a bit brighter than the other one. It's pretty amazing. So this is what the lesser looks like. The lesser is in the blue-eyed leucistic complex, and it's usually a really high contrast snake with a lot of bright colors and high definition. And here's what happens if you work one copy of the ghost into the lesser. Take a look at this. This is quite amazing. As a matter of fact, this is actually two different breeders and two different lines of lessers. So sometimes it's kind of hard to kind of compare them side by side. But I'd say based on the two lessers that I have, this is pretty much the difference between my het ghost lesser and the one that's just regular lesser. And one of them, the one that's just regular, kind of has this darker appearance to the top. The one that's possible het ghost, I'd say, has this almost like a more washed out top to it. A lot brighter of a color as far as kind of the overall color of the snake. I'd say this one is definitely het ghost, and it's kind of hard, you know, trying to compare two different lines, but I'd say that is probably what I'm seeing in my collection here, the influence of one copy of the ghost. And I'd say when you work ghost into most other combinations with just one copy of the gene, you pretty much see the same kind of brightening effect. As a matter of fact, when I'm actually doing a lot of these morph reviews and looking at all these snakes over on Morphmarket, and I'm kind of comparing, like, you know, the mystics to the Mojaves or something like that, trying to pick out the slight differences, usually I'll avoid the snakes and the examples that are het ghost, because I know sometimes one copy of the ghost can kind of trick you into thinking one is a little bit brighter than the other when you're trying to compare two genes side by side. So take a look at this one. This is actually a Ruso, which some people consider, the Ruso is also called het leucistic or het white diamond. And it can be a little bit confusing because, believe it or not, this is actually not a recessive gene. There's a few examples in ball pythons where you'll have hets that are not actually recessives. There's the het leucistic, also known as the Ruso, and there's the het red axanthic, which is also a codominant. So it can get a little bit confusing. And kind of the weird thing about the Ruso is just as a standalone gene, it almost looks like a normal ball python. Some people say they're a little bit brighter than a normal, and sometimes it's pretty hard to tell the Ruso from, you know, just a normal. As a matter of fact, if you actually work Ruso in a lot of combinations, sometimes it's really difficult to know if you have Ruso in the mix. I've actually seen a lot of ball pythons over on Morphmarket that have multiple genes, and then at the end they'll just say this is possible Ruso, because a lot of times they're not 100% sure if Ruso is in the mix. So this is actually a codominant, because in certain combinations you can always see the Ruso every single time, and that is pretty much the dividing line between the codominants and the recessives. You know, if you can always see the het pied markers every single time in every single snake, then the pied could technically be considered a codominant, because you can always see one copy of the gene. So here's what happens if you take a Ruso, you breed two of them together, 25% of the time this is what you get. You get a white diamond, and take a look at this beauty. That is an amazing snake. As a matter of fact, when I'm selling snakes at the reptile shows, I have these blue-eyed leucistics in my case, and everyone comes up, they're like, hey, can we hold the white snake? That is so awesome. They're just especially, seems like especially with the super Rusos, they seem really super bright with these really bright blue eyes. Pretty amazing snake. So pretty much all the other genes, you really can't see one copy of a recessive gene pretty much across the board with the albinos, the tri-stripes, and all that. The only one that's kind of on the edge that I've heard some debate over is the clown. And the clown's kind of interesting. This is a recessive mutation. You need two copies of the clown for visual. And some people say that if you have a het clown, sometimes you can see different markers. As a matter of fact, I actually pulled one up over here. Take a look at this. This is a normal 100% het clown, and it looks almost like a normal ball python. And I've actually seen quite a few het clowns, and I cannot for the life of me pick out the het clown markers. Some people claim that they can, but I'd say it's not 100%, and it's some people debate that you can actually pick out the het clown markers. Some people say that the het clown is a little bit lighter and a little bit brighter than a normal if you line them up side by side, which I haven't really had, you know, a whole bunch of experience breeding het clowns in my collection. As a matter of fact, I just bought a banana inchy clown this year. I'm going to breed her to breed them to a whole bunch of stuff this year. Hopefully I'll get a bunch of het clowns and I can actually line them up and compare side by side, which would be pretty cool. But sometimes a lot of people say that the het clowns have bigger alien eyes in the bigger eyes in the alien heads. So for this example, you can see this is kind of like a Roswell gray alien head right here on the side of the snake with the two little eyes. Some people say that you can kind of pick out the het clowns by the bigger eyes in the alien heads, which I thought was kind of an interesting anomaly. As a matter of fact, if you actually line up a whole bunch of normals side by side, the eyes and the alien heads can be really variable from one to the other. Sometimes, I don't know if that is 100% guarantee that you can actually pick out the het clown. I actually heard one guy said on all of his het clowns, every single one that he's ever produced, he's actually taken the tail, flipped over the tail, and he said there was a black line from the vent all the way to the tip of the tail on all of his het clowns. I thought that was kind of interesting, but I've only heard it once, and I haven't really heard a lot of people reproduce that, you know, kind of that marker for the het clowns. So I think the jury is still out on correctly identifying the markers for the het clown. All right, so it is time for the question of the day. And Louis Edelman asks, how often do you feed your ball python hatchlings? And that is a very good question. So essentially when a ball python first comes out of the egg, pretty much for the first week or two, it won't eat anything at all until they all go through the first shed cycle. And I've actually tried to feed them right when they come out of the egg. Let me tell you, maybe only 2 or 3 out of 100 will actually eat before they shed for the first time. So I pretty much don't even feed my hatchlings for the first 2 weeks. And then after that, I think most people recommend that you feed them probably every 3 to 7 days. Most people do like every 4 or 5 days, and it really depends on kind of what's going on with the hatchling. As the hatchling gets bigger, it really depends on the size of the rodents too. So if you're feeding really small rodents, sometimes you can increase the frequency to maybe every 2 or 3 days, depending on what you're using. And sometimes if you're using a bigger rodent, and it really depends on the kind of the condition of the snake too. So if I'm feeding bigger rodents and they're eating more frequently, and I kind of peek in the tub and I see a really fat, pudgy hatchling, I definitely won't feed that thing until it kind of thins out a little bit. And if I see one that's just really super skinny, even though I fed it maybe a couple days ago, sometimes I'll follow up with another one, maybe even 2 in the same day, depending on what the kind of what the size of the hatchling looks like. And it really depends on pretty much the appetite of the hatchling. Sometimes they all won't feed every single time that you try to feed them. It can be really frustrating. I found pretty much usually right at the beginning, they'll start with live mouse hoppers. I actually raise my own mice here, and that's another challenge here in my reptile room. I'm actually feeding live mice to my hatchling, and I actually can have 50 to 100 hatchlings pretty much all at once in any given year. And if all those hatchlings show up at the same time, let me tell you, I have a hard time producing that many hatchlings, especially if I'm feeding more than once a week. That's like 100 mice every single week, and if I do twice a week, that's 200, and I just don't have that many mice. And kind of the other thing about kind of raising my own rodents for my hatchlings is sometimes you run up against the wall where if you don't feed a lot right away, a lot of times your rodents can get too big too fast. They grow really super fast. And if you wait a week or two, those hopper mice can grow into small adults where they're almost too big for your hatchlings. So it's really kind of a balance raising your own mice for the first few feedings. And once you get pretty much beyond the live mice, you can go to a frozen thawed mice. And pretty much on, pretty much the off time of the season, what I do is I euthanize a lot of my mice kind of at the hopper size or small adult. So I have a really big supply in my freezer for hatchling time. So I can kind of try to transition them from the live mouse hoppers over to the frozen thawed. So as a matter of fact, last year I wasn't freezing a lot of my mice, and I kind of ran into that problem where I ran out of mice and I had to make these big orders of mice from these online places that sell rodents, and it was pretty expensive. I'd rather try to produce them here in my collection and then feed them frozen thawed as soon as I can after they get off of the live mice. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.